Okay, Mr. Chair, we're live.
Thank you very much. And welcome to, I'm sure, the thousands of viewers we have watching our briefing on tax credit evaluation. Let me turn first. I think Chair Kaiser had some opening words.
I really just wanted to follow up, but thank you, Delegate Lukey, Chair Lukey, and to your whole subcommittee and for the great work you're doing. And I'm just glad to be joining you today. Back to you.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. So to the members of the committee, obviously we're no strangers to the topic of tax credit evaluation. It's something we discussed during the 2020 legislative session. It is going to come up again during the 2021 legislative session. It's almost 10 years now since the Tax Credit Evaluation Act passed. And we continue to have debates about individual credits, but having a process in place that can evaluate credits, that can produce recommendations for improving those credits, and then us following up as a committee to actually implement those recommendations when they make sense. I think we have a lot of work to do to make sure we're following that entire process all the way through. And I think we got to start at it this last session, and I'm hoping it continues. But I asked George and DLS and invited the folks from Pew so that we could continue that discussion and get their recommendations and best advice for how we can do a better job with tax credit evaluation. The agenda today, we're going to start with a briefing from George Butler and Robert Rehrman from DLS, and then we're going to turn to Mr. Goodman from the Pew Trust to talk to us a little bit about their recommendations. They are national experts on tax credit evaluation. If at any time any member of the committee has a question, to let me know you have a question, please use the participants tab and click on the raise hand function, or as my children's teachers refer to it, the Smurf hand, so that I know that I should call on you. But with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Butler and Mr. Rehrman to start us off.
Thank you, Chair Lukey. For the record, once again, my name is George Butler, Department of Legislative Services. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Robert Rehrman. We're going to provide an overview of Maryland's tax credit evaluation procedures. Next slide, please. Since the mid-1990s, the number of state business tax credits has grown significantly, as have related concerns about the actual benefits and costs of many of these credits. Although tax credits comprise a small percentage of total income tax revenues, the number and amount of credits claimed has significantly increased over time. The total amount expended for credits has increased from a little less than $50 million in tax year 1994 to about $300 million in tax year 2019. In response to concerns about the fiscal impact of tax credits on state finances, Chapters 562 and 569 of 2012, the Tax Credit Evaluation Act, established a legislative process for evaluating certain tax credits. Next slide. The evaluation process is conducted by a legislative evaluation committee and must be done in consultation with the Comptroller's Office, the Department of Budget and Management, the Department of Legislative Services, and the agency that administers each tax credit. The committee is appointed jointly by the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Delegates, and must include at least one member of the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee and one member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Next slide, please. Section 1-303 of the Tax Journal article specifies the schedule for conducting evaluations of tax credits in accordance with this act. Generally, the continuation of a tax credit designated for evaluation is for a 7-year period, and the credit is subject to reevaluation 7 years after the previous evaluation. So as an example, in 2014, evaluations of the Enterprise Zone and One Maryland Economic Development credits were delivered, and likewise, they're being reevaluated currently so that those reports can be delivered in 2021. Next slide. Thank you. By June 30th of the year prior to a tax credits evaluation date, the evaluation committee is required to meet with the Comptroller's Office, DBM, DLS, and the agency that administers the credit to prepare a plan for evaluation. By November 15th of that same year, DLS is required to publish a report evaluating the tax credit that discusses 1, the purpose for which the tax credit was established, 2, whether the original intent of the tax credit is still appropriate, 3, whether the tax credit is meeting its objectives, 4, whether the goals in the tax credit could be more effectively carried out by other means, and 5, the cost of the tax credit to the state and local governments. Next slide. By December 31st of the same year, the Evaluation Committee must hold a public hearing on the evaluation report, at which the public may submit testimony. By the 20th day of the legislative session before the evaluation date of the tax credit, the committee is required to submit a report to the General Assembly. That report must state whether or not the tax credit should be continued, with or without changes, or terminated, and it shall be accompanied by any legislation that is needed to accomplish the recommendations in the report. Next slide. As DLS has conducted evaluations under the Act, several challenges have emerged. First, the statute does not reflect the actual process or practice for how evaluations have been conducted. Although it's the Evaluation Committee that is tasked in statute to meet with the specified agencies to prepare a plan for evaluation, DLS has undertaken this responsibility to consult with these agencies. Second, the timeline for evaluations prescribed in statute may not be practical under some circumstances. With respect to new programs, DLS has found some deadlines to have been set too early, and therefore we lacked sufficient data to conduct a thorough evaluation of the program. In other instances, statutory deadlines may not be ideal when they coincide with recent statutory changes to a program. And lastly, the statutory deadlines for publishing reports may not provide an adequate period of time for stakeholders to comment on the findings and recommendations that DLS has prepared. The next slide, please. As you will recall, during the 2020 legislative session, this committee undertook an effort to examine multiple tax credit programs. As a part of that effort, leadership of the committee and this subcommittee engaged DLS to craft a different way going forward that would ensure that the General Assembly continues to receive the information that it requires to evaluate the effectiveness of the state's tax credit programs, but also allows DLS to more dynamically respond to inquiries by the legislature about specific components of tax credit programs and other tax incentives. The newly revamped Joint Audit and Evaluation Committee statute served as a model to these proposed alterations. Next slide. So as amended by this committee, House Bill 565 proposed to alter the tax credit evaluation in 3 respects. First, it proposed eliminating the tax credit evaluation committee and instead would have required DLS to conduct evaluations on request from the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, the Executive Director of DLS, or Director of the Office of Policy Analysis of DLS. Second, it proposed expanding the scope of the Act to include not only tax credits, but also other tax exemptions and preferences. And lastly, in light of this expanded scope, and for the requirement to DLS to conduct evaluations on request, the bill would have removed the schedule of evaluations to be conducted from statute. At this point in time, if there's any questions by the members of the committee that we could answer, we'd be more than happy to.
Thank you, George. While I'm waiting to see questions from committee members, again, if you have questions, please use the raise hand function. George, I'm curious, does DLS track, have you all tracked at all how often the recommendations in the reports have actually been implemented or made it into practice or law?
Robert, I don't know if you can speak specifically to that. I would say that offhand, I don't recall offhand if we have something internally that does so.
That's correct, George. I think it's more informal, but we don't have a tracking mechanism for those recommendations.
Mr. Bishop, your mute button's still on.
I am muted, aren't I? Sorry about that. To follow up on what Robert said, the first couple of years we did these evaluations, it took a little bit of time for the legislature to kind of review what we were doing. And the very first credit I think we did, Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, was the earned income credit, which is tied closely, or one of the first ones. It's tied very closely to the federal credit. So we made a lot of recommendations, but the legislature really wasn't ready to tackle some of them. There were really structural changes to the credit. As the evaluation process went on, though, there were a number of recommendations that the legislature adopted relating to the job creation tax credit, to what's now called I think the historic rehabilitation tax credit, which used to be known as the heritage tax credit, and then some changes, I think, to the biotech and maybe the, I'm drawing a blank on the cybersecurity tax credits as well. So it's been kind of hit or miss, but there have been some changes in recent years to tax credits that we looked at a little later on.
And the original Tax Credit Evaluation Act, if I remember correctly, the idea was that all of these credits would be automatically sunset and then have to be renewed with legislation, that legislation then would include, so you'd have this automatic process like we do for sunset evaluations in labor, right?
Yeah, it wasn't so much that they would sunset per se, but that I think every 7 years that we would revisit the credit and look at it again, because some of the credits don't have sunsets, some of them do. In some cases, we recommended that a sunset be eliminated, or that it only be, I think, maybe extended by some period of time, but it was designed to be similar to the sunset process in that you had a continued evaluation of the credits after a period of time.
Delegate Feldmark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on that point about sunsetting, I guess, I think the part of the conversation has been that the sunset serves as a forced review, right? Which may not happen otherwise. And so I guess if there are recommendations for certain tax credits not to sunset, what alternative is there to kind of really push the question of giving it a proactive, evaluation and reconsideration?
Yeah, speaking on behalf of the department, we have always advocated to the legislature that tax credits have sunsets, whether we have done that formally or informally. But the nature of these tax credits, some of them were created as long ago as the mid to late 1990s. If they didn't already have a sunset on them, it's oftentimes tough to get a sunset on them because you have the advocacy groups or whoever is lobbying for the credit or like the credit don't like the idea of a sunset. We hear oftentimes from the business community that when you sunset things or you place budgetary limitations on credits, that can cause businesses to shy away from claiming the credit, or they don't have certainty. I mean, we hear that about a lot of issues, obviously, that you've heard of related to taxes and tax rate changes and things like that. But we have always formally and informally advised that you should have sunsets for that very reason. So you at least have to have some legislative review, even if we haven't done an evaluation of the credit. You at least have another shot at some point to review what we may know or not know about the credit.
And from a policy perspective, there's really not a sort of a comparable alternative other than we've got to proactively do it or it goes away.
Right. The other thing that we did institute starting in the mid 2000s with the former heritage structure, now historic revitalization tax credit, was budgeting in the budget for certain amounts for credits. That is one way that the legislature, you can have some control over that. But again, that gets into the budgetary process and things of that nature. But that was another mechanism that we instituted to try to at least have you have some control over tax credits going forward, whether they had a sunset or not.
Can I ask to follow up on Delegate Feldmark's questions? I mean, wouldn't it be possible to design a process like this process that works for the sunset evaluations for the, different boards within labor where, whatever recommendations were made by DLS, there was some automatically introduced legislation that then served as a vehicle for considering changes?
You could. It would probably be easier, quite frankly, if you just had an omnibus bill where you put sunsets on everything. What we found with the sunset process is that there would be an automatic sunset, and almost inevitably the legislature, regardless of what recommendations we came back with, would basically extend the sunset by another 10 years or by a minimum of 3 to 5 years. And we actually just revamped the sunset evaluations where we're actually no longer doing that. Our Office of Program Evaluation will be doing program evaluations, but the boards and commissions themselves now have to come back to the legislature with their own legislation to re-up their sunsets.
Subcommittee members, any further questions before we move on to Mr. Goodman? I know everyone's tired. It's like the 4th Tuesday this week today, so I get it. All right, well then we will turn now to Mr. Goodman with Pew, who can talk to us a little bit about their advice on how to handle tax credit evaluations.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. My name is Josh Goodman. I'm a senior officer with the Pew Charitable Trust with a project called the State Fiscal Health Project. And a big part of our work really over the last 10 years has been helping states to evaluate the effectiveness of their economic development tax incentives. So it's really exciting always to be talking with lawmakers about this topic. Next slide, please. So first, just by way of background, I'm going to talk a little bit about evaluation processes, how they work, why to do them, and then I'll offer some specific thoughts on Maryland and what you do right now. The basic idea of why to evaluate incentives is that they're important policy decisions. They're one of states' primary economic development tools, and they also collectively cost states many billions of dollars a year. And just relating to this discussion you're already having, we've certainly seen many instances around the country where they do lead to policy changes and sometimes very major policy changes. Washington, D.C., for example, just recently revamped one of their biggest incentives for high technology companies on the basis of some evaluations there. And one reason I think incentives are conducive to evaluations and why evidence can really make a difference in this area, not that I would argue against evidence in any other policy area, but is that the details really matter. And so subtle decisions such as, who the beneficiaries are, how the programs are administered can really make a big difference in their results. And evaluations can sort of help you get those details right. Next slide, please. And so with that in mind, we've really seen a lot of momentum around the country with more states evaluating incentives. Maryland was actually towards the beginning of this trend. And so most of these states have started evaluation processes within the last decade, many of them within the last 5 years. And there's different levels. Some of them are just getting started. There's different levels of quality of them. But what we really do see is lawmakers asking these questions about how can we make sure these programs work as well as possible. Next slide, please. So what are you looking for out of an evaluation process? You want some degree of comprehensiveness, at least to examine all of your major economic development tax incentives regularly. And so that kind of helps you look at them as a portfolio. And when you look at incentives together, you can sort of recognize, well, we have these two programs designed to create jobs, but this one seems to work a lot better than that one. Why is that? Maybe we should do more of this one thing and less of this other thing. So those are the kinds of things you learn when you kind of take that more comprehensive approach. And obviously, as you're discussing, the idea is to provide you with reliable, detailed information and analysis that leads to policy improvements. And also, I think no evaluation process that I've seen is perfect the first year it starts or the second year it starts. And so having these conversations about how to refine the process is also really important. Next slide, please. So then in speaking to the evaluations themselves, good evaluations include a mix of qualitative and quantitative information. They start often with a description of the incentive, its history, its goals. What is this program? Why did we create it? What were we trying to achieve? They also include an assessment of the incentives design and administration. So if it is these companies that we're providing tax credits to, why those companies? What are the rules by which they qualify for the incentives? How are state agencies monitoring their compliance with those rules? And then, are they fulfilling their obligations? Those kinds of things are what good evaluations do. And they kind of marry that analysis with the more quantitative side. What's the economic impact? What's the impact on our budget? And you combine all these different pieces of information and you come up with often some really compelling policy recommendations how to improve the programs. Next slide, please. So where does Maryland's evaluation process fit in? First of all, I think DLS and really everyone involved in the evaluations deserves a lot of credit for producing detailed, high quality evaluations. If you read through their evaluations, it really checks all the boxes that I just described of, when economic analysis is sort of what's necessary, they do that. They always have a great deal of information on the design, the goals, those kinds of questions. I think sort of going with that level of detail, the scope of the process is relatively narrow right now. It's focused on a specific set of tax credits, whereas other states look more broadly to include economic development tax incentives, whether they're tax credits or not. Some of them include cash incentives, such as grant or loan programs, and some of them aren't focused on economic development at all, but a broader range of tax exemptions or tax expenditures. As you were saying, there's this question about how can evaluations contribute to policy discussions and policy changes more consistently. Next slide, please. So now I just want to talk through sort of some of the considerations that go into how you might change the process in a little more detail. So in relating to the scope, as I just mentioned, there's this question of how broad you want the process to be. And so some states, when we're doing these evaluation processes, they really are squarely focused on economic development. We're examining our economic development programs. And so that could include the cash programs in addition to the tax incentive programs. There are other states that are saying, we have all these credits, deductions, and exemptions on the books. Some of them are for economic development, some of them are for businesses, some of them are for individuals, and we need to know about all of those. I think in thinking about this, a few points I'd make. One is that we don't have an opinion about, you have to look at all tax expenditures or just focus on economic development. It really depends where lawmakers think they need information. But a few things I would recommend. One is, if you're focused on economic development, you need to make sure you include all the major programs. And so I don't know that there would be a rationale to say only tax credits if you have other economic development programs that are major programs that would also benefit from evaluation. I also think that when we look at evaluations around the country, you see different kinds of analysis for different types of tax expenditures. So if it is an all tax expenditure process, if you're looking at something like, a sales tax exemption on prescription drug sales, that doesn't require the same economic analysis that you would perform for a job creation tax credit. So just thinking about what do we need for these different types of programs. Next slide, please. So because part of this conversation is, do we need a broader scope? I wanted to mention a few things that, if you are thinking about broadening the scope, to consider. One is that some states allow for expedited reviews. And so an expedited review wouldn't be, this 100-page report that goes into incredible depth about every detail of a program. It might focus just on its goals, its history, how much it costs, sort of maybe a little context on whether that type of program is typically effective. And then it's the kind of thing where lawmakers would have that information, and if they said, really, we do need a full evaluation of it, they could then ask for it. Another consideration as you get sort of deeper, states have been doing this for a longer period of time, is what do you do when you're evaluating programs the state has studied previously? So as was mentioned earlier, Maryland is at this point where it's looking at programs it's studied previously. I think one option would be to say, you know, as you look at those, start by asking whether anything's changed. Do the recommendations that you had, you know, last time still apply? Is it clear that something's different? And so you might be able to do a shorter analysis if you're looking at the same programs over again. You can always reduce the frequency of evaluations if you need to. I would say the 7 years that Maryland is at now is toward the longer end of what states do. So I think if you get much longer than that, then you're going to have legislators who don't necessarily have recent information on these programs, but that is always an option. And then of course, you can always increase staffing if you want more evaluations, but you need to weigh that against your other budget considerations. Next slide, please. So in addition to thinking about the scope, there are also questions about how you organize a schedule. And some strategies we see other states using is grouping similar programs together. So if you have a series of programs that are all about helping small businesses or benefiting distressed areas, you might put those together to allow for comparisons between them. Also, as has been mentioned, it really is helpful to evaluate programs prior to their sunset dates, because that is a natural time to make changes to the program. It's when lawmakers often are really looking for information to make decisions. And then I think there is a case for allowing for flexibility. And so Maryland right now, you know, it's a specific year in statute that we're going to evaluate this program this year, this program this year. An approach some other states do is to say, we're going to evaluate each program at least once every X years, or this set of programs will evaluate at least once every 7 years or 8 years or 5 years or whatever it might be. But we're not going to say the year in statute. And so then we can kind of see what rises to the top in terms of lawmakers' interests when there is a debate going on that particular program. Next slide, please. And then I also wanted to talk about the strategies to elevate evaluation findings. How can you make sure that you're considering this information? I don't think anyone would ever expect that every recommendation of every evaluation would be implemented. It's obviously up to you as lawmakers to ultimately come to those decisions, but you want to have the information. And so legislative hearings can help. That's something obviously Maryland has already done. Using sunset dates is certainly a useful approach. One state I would point you to is Oregon. Oregon is a state that went back and did put sunsets on almost all of their tax credits. And that happened, I think, now about 12 or 13 years ago. And they've really seen that did make a difference in terms of encouraging policy changes. I've also certainly seen other states like New Jersey and Nebraska where some of their biggest incentives have had sunset dates, and it really does contribute to a policy discussion. I think to the point, the discussion earlier about sunsets contributing to uncertainty, one thing you can do, and this is the way sunsets work in most states, is it doesn't have to be a hard cutoff when you reach a sunset date. Like if you have a program that, say, provides tax credits to businesses that create jobs, and businesses enter into, say, a 5-year contract where, you know, if you create jobs each year, you receive tax credits. If a business enters into that contract a year before the sunset date, you can still have that business guaranteed those incentives for 5 years. And then it's just a question sort of going forward, new businesses entering the program, whether they qualify for credits. And so I think that can help deal at least to some degree with the uncertainty questions that come with sunsets. Another point I'd make is that it isn't just legislative changes that you want coming out of evaluations. Often evaluations will have recommendations for the administering agency. And so finding ways to communicate findings to executive agencies is important. Some states, such as Oklahoma, actually have commissions that include executive branch officials who are part of the evaluation process. And so that might be a way to make sure that they're hearing these findings. And then finally, I think we're seeing some states conduct follow-up reviews where they look back at, were recommendations implemented both on the legislative side and the executive branch side. And they're often also producing reports that kind of go back and summarize previous evaluation findings or point out common themes from evaluations. So that's something we've seen in Missouri. And so I think doing things like that can help compared to having a legislative hearing, which is great, but it's just a one-time event and then you kind of move on. Giving evaluation sort of a longer shelf life can be a helpful approach. Next slide, please. So I just want to conclude by describing one state example from Washington State and how they've thought about some of these same questions. Washington State has one of the longest standing and best established evaluation processes. And a few years ago, much like Maryland, they were hitting the 10-year point of doing these evaluations. And they were thinking about how are we going to change things for the next 10 years? And so in thinking about a new 10-year schedule, some of their considerations include grouping preferences for similar industries in the same year. Washington is a place that uses expedited reviews. So in deciding what deserved an expedited review, they were looking at the amount of the preference, how much it costs. They were thinking about expiration dates in this schedule. They were considering whether lawmakers had specifically asked for a review of a particular preference besides their overall, general evaluation process. And they were thinking about also some of them, because they have this very broad process that applies to all credits, exemptions, and deductions. They were looking at which ones they consider sort of a critical part of the state tax structure that they really wouldn't seriously consider changing. And those probably deserve less review than ones that are really up for debate. And they also considered the results of previous reviews. So if you had an evaluation that said a program wasn't working very well, and then you made some reforms to it, you probably want to look back and see, did those reforms actually work? Next slide, please. So this is just an example of what an expedited review looks like in Washington. And as you can see, it's really just one page with some descriptive information, some information on the purpose, how much it costs. And hopefully it's enough that lawmakers could say, yeah, yes, we need more information, or no, we're okay with this one, we don't need more information. You could also do an expedited review that would provide somewhat more detail than this without doing a full evaluation. Next slide, please. And then finally, Washington has used this dashboard of evaluation findings, which is helpful for kind of looking back at, did we make these changes? Have they been implemented? And I think it's not just useful for tracking, the results of the evaluation process, but also helpful for lawmakers so that if you're going back and studying a program that was evaluated 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, one of the first things you might want to ask was, well, what did the evaluation really find? Is this a program we've evaluated? So this provides kind of an easy way to go back and do that. Next slide, please. So that was all I had. I really appreciate, once again, this conversation. I think it's great that you're talking about the future of the evaluation process, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Goodman. I think first up is Delegate Polakovich-Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So thank you, everyone, for the presentations. They were very informative. I guess one thing that I'm thinking about is, at the kind of the forefront of the process when we're creating tax credits, if there might be things that we could be doing, best practices from other states to kind of ensure that we have the information or, whatever is needed in the enacted law to be able to have a good evaluation, a few years down the road. And if there might be information from other states that can help us in that direction.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And that's actually something we've done some research on, and there are states that are working on that. So New Mexico, for example, whenever there's a new tax credit proposed in New Mexico, they kind of have this checklist that the legislative staff produces that looks at both sort of questions of process. Did this go through an interim committee process? But also looks at kind of whether it meets some general principles for for these programs that lawmakers have established. So is there a sunset date? Are there fiscal protections on the program? What do we know about, whether this is the type of program that's actually likely to influence behavior in the way that we intended? And so there is that kind of detail in New Mexico. Another approach we've seen in some states, such as Maine, is when they adopt a new program, they'll do it kind of on a preliminary basis. And so Maine created this new economic development tax incentive, but they waited 1 year to implement it, and they asked the same staff that does their evaluations of existing programs, hey, do an evaluation of this new program. We know that there won't be any data yet on who the beneficiaries are, how many jobs have been created, but you can still do those things about the design of the program, whether the administering agency is going to be able to run this program effectively. You can ask those questions, which are really hard to ask in the kind of rush of a legislative session, but using the interim period then to ask those questions was really helpful for them, and they did make some changes. So those are a couple of options that are out there.
Thank you. Do you think you'd be able to follow up with that checklist from New Mexico and share that with the committee?
Yep, absolutely. I'll do that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Delegate Feldmark, your hand is still up. I'm not sure if it's from before or.
I apologize, but I was actually kind of formulating a question. In the review, and maybe this is in the checklist that you just spoke about, but in the review, I think some credits are more explicit about really their intended outcome and purpose, and some are, there's a sense of, okay, it's to support economic development, but it's a less explicit goal, right? And sort of rationale for how the tax credit is expected to achieve that goal. Is that piece, sort of clarifying purpose at the beginning, is that part of the best practice checklist you were referring to, or is there something you have on that?
Yeah, it actually is part of that checklist, and it's something also other states do, where we've seen, legislative committees who it's part of their process whenever they adopt a new tax expenditure. As a matter of committee rules, there has to be a purpose on that, and it's something that when we talk to the people around the country who do evaluations, the professional staff, often they'll ask us, well, how do I start? I have to study this program. How do I start? And the thing we almost always tell them is, well, you have to start with the goal of the program. And if you don't know the goal, you can't tell whether it's been a success or not. So I do think it's really an essential piece. And I think being specific about the goal can be helpful. It might not be that the goal is so specific that we wanted to create it, 500 jobs exactly, but to talk to say something more than economic development. If you're trying to create jobs, what kind of jobs are you trying to create? Who do you want to fill those jobs? Are there considerations related to where they're located within the state, distressed areas or not, whether their wages they pay, the benefits they offer, those kinds of things can really help when you go to study these programs to figure out whether they worked or they didn't work.
It's a great question, Delegate Feldmark. First of all, let me mention Senator Griffith has joined us. I did invite members of BNT if they wanted to join in. So the senator has joined us as well. Delegate Feldmark, I had asked DLS the question a couple weeks ago, I think, of whether we could mandate that new tax credit proposals had to include measurable objectives in them. And just from a legal standpoint, we can't do it through statute because we can't bind future legislatures through that. But it is something we could think about through rules or much more easily just through committee practice.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that? Mm-hmm. Is it something that could be sort of a required piece of the fiscal note, the analysis that we get on bills that propose tax credits? Like, I don't know how the requirements for what DLS includes in their analysis get set, but could there be sort of provisions that if a piece of legislation is proposing a tax credit, then DLS will, in its fiscal note, include XYZ as part of, sort of specific analysis.
Mr. Butler, Mr. Rehrman, I'm not sure if you want to respond further. I mean, my understanding would be that we could require that as a part of the fiscal and policy note, that DLS sort of have a checklist. Does this bill have measurable objectives? And the fiscal and policy note would just say yes or no. But Mr. Butler, I don't know if you have more.
I think to your point, if the requirement is for the Department of Legislative Services to evaluate whether or not those goals or particular metrics are included as part of the legislation, then I think that we could do so. I would say that I wouldn't task the department with trying to state in the fiscal note what the sponsor's intent with the credit is.
But it would be possible to just say, the sponsor included intent language.
That is correct.
Okay. I see, first of all, we've been joined now by Senator McCray as well. This is turning into the most popular hearing in Annapolis right now. Delegate Wilkins, go ahead.
Thank you. Making sure you can hear me because I'm doing phone audio. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. I had more of a comment after spending considerable time during the 2020 session reviewing a number of tax credits. I think this hearing is so appropriate and so helpful, and you all do such an amazing and thorough job when it comes to those reviews. I really heard something that I think we should consider as we look forth in making sure that we're being as efficient as possible. I think it was called the expedited review. And I think that that's something that I wanted to lift up because after reading through many of the reviews from DLS, they're certainly very thorough. But I think that adding a combination of kind of the bottom lines with the critical pieces of information can reduce the burden on DLS, while also for us legislators who are, looking to better just be clear about the goals and understand some of the feedback and concerns from the review. I think that that's something that can really be helpful on both sides. So I wanted to lift up what I heard in terms of best practices with incorporating some of this expedited. I think there's a combination of us having the very thorough analysis while also kind of condensing it in that way. So I wanted to add that comment.
Hear, hear. Absolutely. Delegate, I'm jealous, by the way, of all of my colleagues who are actually outside instead of just with a Zoom background. I think I have to go outside after this to make up for it. Delegate Polakovich-Carr.
Thank you. So I guess one other question I have for any of the presenters is there anything that we could be doing in terms of how we structure tax credits in law to ensure that when local governments have like a key reporting requirement so that we actually can do full evaluations, that we're getting that data? I can think of at least one example in Maryland where because the local governments aren't really collecting the data that's needing, it really hampers DLS's ability to actually do a full evaluation of those tax credits. And so I'm just wondering if anyone has thoughts on that.
Sure, I can offer some thoughts, and if George or Robert, if you have thoughts, feel free to jump in. Data is certainly one of the critical limitations that, I mean, when we have meetings with the people who evaluate incentives from around the country, often a third of the discussion focuses on data because that's one of the big challenges. So I think it really is a mix of using creative approaches to study programs. Even when you don't have data, you can still look at the design of the program. You can do other things where you sort of extrapolate, but also using evaluations as an opportunity to improve data. And that's one reason it's so important to have these be ongoing processes. Is often the first time you study a program, it might be, well, here are our conclusions, But if we had had all this other data, we could have done a much better study. And part of our recommendation is that we should start collecting that data. And so I think what we see is often when you do have a second round of evaluations, that's when you've solved some of those data challenges, hopefully.
I would say that we have some of the evaluations I've participated in the past have identified some of these data issues, and in response, reporting requirements have been strengthened to provide data in the future and to provide the legislature data on a more regular basis in some instances, so that that can shape the legislature's actions in the future. One other item I would note is just challenges that our department faces generally in light of the structure of the legislative session during the first third of the year, and that leaves a shorter period of time during the remaining 8 months to try to accommodate the evaluations that we are tasked to conduct.
If I could build on what George said, I think for in 2017 there was legislation by the Department of Commerce to address some of the reporting difficulties, and it did propose to mandate those reporting requirements, and then it would actually revoke eligibility for the program if those reporting requirements were not met. That's a rather strong approach, but that was something that was proposed by the Department of Commerce in 2017. And I think if I could talk a little bit more about some of the data issues as well, that is a consistent issue. And one thing that legislative services is in terms of confidential information, we don't have access to certain information that does make it a little more challenging on a granular basis. And I think one thing I can think of offhand is when we're evaluating these job creation tax credits, for a business, it'll only be reported how much that the employment that they qualify for that credit. So if they get a One Maryland credit for 25 jobs, when I'm looking back on data, that's the only thing I can work off. And I think it would be very useful to know what has happened to their total employment at that plant. So there were certainly other things like that. I won't go into more detail, but those are the kind of questions that I think make some evaluations a little challenging. And there's always, admittedly, in terms of asking more information versus its usefulness, I do think those things would be helpful to us.
Thank you very much. Senator Griffith, I think, has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for including us in this meeting. I was jumping off of another meeting and joined this one late, so if this was covered in the presentation, my apologies in advance. I was wondering, I caught the end of the Washington evaluation tool, and I'm wondering if they had come up with a way to capture those kind of one-off benefits, sort of the indirect dollars that may be generated due to a tax credits implementation, those, and also the qualitative impacts. Was there anything about that that I missed in the presentation?
Yeah, I'm not sure I covered that specifically, but there are a couple of things that's kind of come to mind. One is that when you're evaluating these programs, it's helpful sometimes to distinguish if it is sort of like, you know, a specific project that you're building. Okay, this is an incentive for a particular factory, or you know, you have programs that are broadly available to hundreds of beneficiaries. You have others where, whether it's explicit in statute or not, it's really for one particular place. And thinking through kind of both the construction phase and the operation phase can be useful for those. So it might be very different, you know, when you're building something, the type of jobs you have versus when you're actually operating it. So that's one thing that comes to mind. When you do economic analysis of these programs, it's really important to consider both the positive and the negative indirect benefits. And so some of the positive indirect benefits could be we created jobs, we raised wages, those workers went out into the economy and they spent more money, and that has indirect positive benefits. But there are also then trade-offs that if you're foregoing tax revenue, you have less money to do everything else. And so what else you would have done with that money also, if we would have spent more on education, that has an economic cost not having that money to do that. So, or whatever part of the budget it might be. So when you get into kind of the more quantitative side of the evaluations, it's those kinds of questions that we see states answering around the country.
Right. So if I could follow up, Mr. Chairman, then there really isn't in that tool a way to sort of directly measure both the indirect benefits and potential opportunity costs is what you're saying.
Yeah. So I think in that particular tool, it's just sort of a guide to this is what we found in our evaluations, but we see that opportunity costs is kind of and that's kind of what I was describing is like, that is a big part of the evaluations and there are a few different ways to do it. Some states, they kind of say, if they're using economic modeling, they kind of model an alternative scenario where they say, okay, this incentive cost us $20 million and here's the benefits of that, but let's just kind of plug into our model. What if we had 20 million more that was spread across the general fund in proportionally to how we spend money on the general fund? Or let's say it was $20 million that we used to reduce business tax rates instead. And so they look at those alternative scenarios to kind of offer some conclusions on whether the opportunity costs sort of offset the benefits of the program.
Yeah, that's tough. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that response.
No problem, Senator. Thanks for joining us. So, Mr. Butler, Mr. Rehrman, I had a follow-up question. How many of our credits, if any, actually include language stating measurable objectives for those credits in the statute? Is that something that has popped up? I know it's not common practice, but.
I would say yes, it's not common. However, to be able to answer the question offhand, I don't have an exact number. Some of the more robust credit programs do include that information. Some of the credit programs that are contained in Title 10, Subtitle 7 of the Tax General Article include information regarding some of the reports that are supposed to be conducted or submitted to the General Assembly with respect to those credits, but may not necessarily clearly specify what the goal of the credit is, but you at least have some metrics to potentially, we're seeing the data that's being submitted back, and that data sometimes can provide some insight into what the General Assembly was looking to see as to whether or not a credit was fulfilling a potential goal. As noted earlier, it isn't common, it's not uniform across all the credits that we do have in code.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. Any further questions from our friends from the Senate or any members of the subcommittee? Well, if not, I think that concludes our hearing. I will say I pulled up the YouTube channel and we peaked at about 15. We got 15 people to watch a YouTube stream about tax credit evaluation on a Friday afternoon. So I consider that alone to be a success. I do expect that we will have some legislation introduced, at least in the House, and some further conversation about this issue in the subcommittee this coming session. In addition, we have a number of upcoming briefings that will start in December with a briefing about the RISE evaluation that was previously done by DLS. And then DLS is working on 3 further reports that should be hopefully done this January. They're obviously under increased challenges because of COVID and the shutdown of the DLS building. But They will be presenting those reports. 2 of them will be re-upped reports on, I believe, the enterprise zone credit and 1 Maryland credit, which have been previously evaluated or being reevaluated. We'll also have an evaluation for the first time of more jobs for Marylanders. So expect those to be showing up on a calendar near you soon. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful weekend.